I like using the term Chicana. One, I am first generation Mexican American, but two, because it has a political origin story. I know what it is to be someone who has parents who were undocumented and not realize the risk that ran. I also know what it means to have naturalized parents who are now US citizens and worry about administrations deciding on a whim that they're going to pull that away. But when it comes to being trans, it's also such a wonderful microcosm in a different expression of what a lot of that oppression looks like in a different flavor. Sure, they are distinct and completely different communities. When you look at each of them and make sure that you take them into account, you start to notice a pattern in how most marginalized communities live. And the oppression is typically seen by focusing on aspects of the community that are deemed undesirable or unprofessional in a lot of spheres, and after villainizing that community for that reason and ostracizing them for that. When I speak as a trans Chicana, someone who has various different neurodivergent labels attached to them, it's because of the fact that I see how interconnected all of those identities are in seeking liberation.
Welcome to Queer Storytime, the podcast. This is a brave space for sharing queer and trans stories of radical affirmation, acceptance, empowerment, and healing. I'm your host, Stevie Ingram, and I so look forward to you joining us. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast across all major podcasting platforms and on YouTube. Alrighty, y'all, queer in 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Welcome all. You are tuned in to episode 30 of QST. Shout out to all of you, my listeners, for making it to episode 30 right along with me. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to share Queer Storytime with your closest friends and allies. Today's episode will feature a second 2026 congressional candidate. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to episode 29, that episode features Senate candidate Dakari Laureate, who's a Black gay man running in Alabama. Given all that the United States is currently facing, I think it's incredibly important to feature queer and transgender congressional candidates right here on Queer Storytime that are going to bring fresh perspectives and community-centered policy initiatives to Washington, D.C. Whereas many within the United States, especially queer and transgender people, are feeling frozen by fear of this administration, I call upon each and every single one of you listening, given your abilities and capacities, to begin organizing within your local community. Now is not the time for us to cower in fear or hide. We must take a collective deep breath, ground ourselves, and work together. None of us can singularly do this work alone. Truth and justice ultimately has always been on our side, which has always been the case historically. It's all too easy at present to be living in an ongoing state of fight or flight. Your mind and heart is racing, your anxiety won't stop, and you're feeling like all you want to do is run away from all of it. If we allow ourselves to remain in this state, we are only giving them exactly what they want: us to be paralyzed by fear and overwhelm. I'm not saying we shouldn't feel fear at all. What I'm suggesting is we must learn to work with it in a more skillful capacity. We must actively practice settling down our worn out minds and bodies so that we can focus, make logical decisions with a clear mind, and unite with our surrounding community to strategize and support one another. So, there's no time like the present. Let's start by taking a few soothing, deep breaths right here and now. I invite each of you to take a moment to calm down your worn out nervous system, to come into the body for a moment, finding your breath, starting with a deep inhalation through the nose or the mouth, holding gently at the top, and then slowly, slowly releasing. We'll take 2 more together. Deeply inhaling and deeply exhaling. Breathing in and a slow, deep, controlled exhale out. And then as you're ready, gently begin opening your eyes. So, your job is not only to practice this here in this moment, but repeatedly throughout the upcoming days, weeks, and months ahead. It takes ongoing practice to learn to find calm amongst the chaos. This will allow every single one of us to not only be better for ourselves individually, but for each other. Consider this your practice of collective care. This is exactly how we create long-term sustainable change, by being so firmly rooted within yourself that you're able to persist through the winds of resistance. Now that you've come to my TED Talk, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Valentina, aka Vale Mendoza, is a transactional attorney turned grassroots congressional candidate, running in New Jersey's 7th district on a bold platform of economic, racial, and social justice. A Chicana, trans woman, and daughter of working class immigrants, Vale knows what it means to navigate systems that were never designed for people like her. She's running to change that. Her journey from Wall Street law to founding her own practice, MeVale PC, was shaped not just by corporate disillusionment, but by the resilience that comes from transition, recovery, and survival. Being openly trans in politics isn't a footnote for Vale. It's a commitment to lead with honesty, to stand visibly for communities too often erased, and to prove that liberation is not an abstract goal, but a lived necessity. Vale's campaign rejects big money politics in favor of grassroots organizing, small dollar donors, and a radical vision for accountability. Whether she's breaking down policy, calling out corporate greed, or connecting with voters face to face, she brings the same unapologetic truth. Justice means all of us, without exception. Welcome, Vale, to Queer Storytime, the podcast. Why don't you start out by telling us about your early life and what led you up to this point on your journey?
Hi, Stevie. Thank you so much. Very excited to be in community and have an opportunity to share a little bit of my story. So you asked specifically about my upbringing, and it was a bit suffocating in a lot of ways. I think is appropriate, and I think is the experience for a lot of trans people who grow up most of their life really suppressing those emotions and those feelings as far as like exploring your identity in any real way. For me, it expressed itself as more of tactful sort of leaning into what felt appropriate as opposed to really exploring what felt organic and joyful. So when I think of my childhood, I think of really focusing on fitting in as best as I could and not really standing out, but more so like fading into the background. And it's unfortunate that that is the case because I think I had a very happy childhood, albeit suffocating. But the reality is that not being able to sort of really express what I felt inside took a long time to unlearn. And you end up with all this pent up sort of like exploration that you need to do in order to really come into your own. So you see a lot of delayed adolescence in certain capacities. And I see that expressed in a lot of my young adulthood. And sort of harnessed at this point, now that I've done a lot of work, into a natural inclination towards a beautiful sorts of innocence and curiosity that I think resonates. Because I think something that most people comment when they meet me is just how fun and joyful I can be about just everyday situations. I try to find playful aspects and not try to take myself too seriously. So I say all that to say that encapsulates the journey towards a political career and what I consider to be something very heavy at this time. My job and what I see that the reason for my campaign really being is I tend to be someone who is incredibly good at finding joy and happiness in the middle of a lot of chaos. And I think it's time we really start focusing on what that means politically and how we start expressing that, because I'm done with this trope that trans people are these victims and are continuously helpless. The most amazing, strong, beautiful people and inspirational people that I've ever met in my life are trans people. And that includes career success, but it also includes personal and just developmental. So I think it's time we start expanding what that looks like. And that's sort of the essence of what this campaign is.
I love that, Vale. It's so exciting to see trans people like aspiring to big roles within society, which clearly many among us don't want to see right now. But I do think it's very encouraging to see, especially queer and transgender people rising up out of the ashes of their survival as children and teenagers, growing up in a world where queer and trans people were not so accepted, especially for the millennial generation. And so it's so wonderful that you and I connected and met on TikTok, like so many, so many great people. First of all, it's amazing to meet other trans women like around your age that are on a similar path and journey. And I just want to express at the beginning of this podcast, I'm so grateful to have you here and learn more about your journey and all that you esteem to become in the upcoming year ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise, it's been such a joy to have gotten to meet you. And then it's such a strange roundabout way because circumstances are so tense, but it really is bringing a lot of people together. And I'm grateful for that aspect of it because I'm not grateful for the circumstances that lead us to feel this way and to feel the need to start building these coalitions. But I do think it was somewhat overdue for us to start finding connection again, especially in the wake of the shutdown during the height of the global pandemic of COVID-19. People started to feel very isolated. And I know I felt the brunt of it myself. So to really seek out community as a byproduct of a lot of hardship, there's some beauty in the aftermath, irrespective of the circumstance.
Absolutely. And that's exactly one of the major intentions is of Queer Storytime is to give us some semblance of community with all of the current chaos going in, not only in the United States, but around the world as well. So that is my sincere hope is that people find some bit of community in this podcast. So Vale, I want to talk about, because you mentioned it in your bio, the importance of striving towards liberation. And people can interpret that in a spiritual way. They can interpret that in a political way. I'm curious for you to speak a little bit more about what that means to you.
I mean, quite literally, when it comes to somebody who is challenging gender norms in the way that they express their identity, it's something that is so fundamental to society that pushing up against that tension, whether it be embracing the other side of the binary or something that is completely distinct, it really does feel like an act of rebellion and liberation to sort of come into your own in that way, because you think of like the tension that comes with it, where to use the restroom, what type of clothes to buy, the types of parties that are had and the colors that are associated. The binary is so ingrained in us that by pushing back against it, you sort of gain this ability to start questioning what is healthy for you and what is correct and what is politically correct, what is accurate. You'd really start challenging what those words mean as they relate to you and societal norms. So for me, liberation is gaining the ability to get to a point where you can pursue happiness. In our founding documents, the right to pursue happiness was something that the founders of this nation took very seriously. Unfortunately, they also were somewhat narrow as to what that meant specifically for different individuals. And that's because these were 30-year-old men in rooms doing something they had never thought of doing before, writing a document that was supposed to last hundreds of years. And it stood the test of time to an extent, but it was supposed to be a living document. And in so many ways, it fails to uplift others by acknowledging this need to let people step into their own. So when I think of what liberation means specifically politically, as far as my campaign and platform is concerned, it's giving people the tools and flexibility to step outside the box and gain that freedom to look at life in ways that might be unorthodox, but nonetheless experimental and also exciting in different ways. And think of it in the sense of economic justice and the ability to form businesses and structures that might challenge norms, mutual aid organizations, cooperatives, anything that I think people have an interest in doing that want to experiment. I think we need to start putting backing into it because the systems that are in place benefit a very specific type of individual. And if we continue to follow those guidelines, we will end up in the same circumstances that we've been repeating and the same failures time and time again because we just aren't willing to push against what these norms are. And I don't mean throwing every tradition out of existence. I mean it more so in the sense that liberation is that freedom to play, and mimicking that for everyday people is important because ultimately what the wealthy elite in this country have, and the reason we glorify them, is they have the ability to take risks and enjoy the freedom that comes with that affluence, which is liberation. I just think everybody should have a taste of that in whatever form they think within certain basic guidelines, right? So that's sort of the way I think of liberation. It's about empowerment, not necessarily rebellion.
Yes, I think that's empowerment. That's absolutely what it's all about. Do you see, talking about like the US Constitution, you studied law, I did not study law, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of these like legal documents that we have like upholding our democracy, are those meant to be a living, breathing, changeable document with the times? Because the reason that I'm asking that is, I think about everything happening in the realm of Christianity. I grew up as a Christian pastor's kid. And my dad, he has his doctoral degree in theology. And he always spoke of that the Bible really is supposed to be a living, breathing document. It's not supposed to be read in like a narrow-minded way. And whereas the Constitution is not the Bible, it's a similar concept to say, like, is this document that has been like written on special pieces of paper and, sealed within various protective chambers and whatever, is it supposed to be a living, breathing document that changes with the times?
I absolutely believe that everything that we do should grow with us as a society. Any form of social contract, any sort of rules we live by should grow with us as opposed to just remaining stagnant in a certain point. And it's because life is so dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And in large part, you see it play out by the number of amendments that have followed, and 10 of which were enacted almost immediately after the Constitution was signed, with the acknowledgement from the founders of this nation that the document that was being passed did not contain certain fundamental rights that needed to be included in order for it to feel more adequate. It was never meant to be a finished product. It was meant to facilitate dialogue. And I think that's something that we've forgotten in this nation, particularly as we grow more polarized. We forget that that polarization isn't the tension we're fighting against. I don't think the answer is a sort of centrist meet at the middle sort of model by which that we water down our opinions before we get to hash them out. What the Constitution does quite well is set up frameworks in order to encourage that dialogue. Unfortunately, it is highly dependent on good faith It's highly dependent on the ability for different factions to have enough of a voice in those forums for it to play out passionately and fervently. I mean, you think of even our form of social justice in this country, and it's all based on advocacy. It's based on argument. It's based on debate. And the idea is that if two sides or more care so passionately about what it is they're arguing, through that dialogue, through that tension, you can come to a better sort of output when it comes to whatever the finished policy might be. The Constitution creates frameworks quite well to sort of hamper what changes over time and make it slow and methodical and purposeful. But again, it's heavily reliant on good faith. And I think we lose that right now because we have a lot of politicians that water down their policies and their positions before even entering elected office and are beholden to structures that are not contemplated by these documents themselves because of the corporate financial affluent like individuals that hold a certain amount of control over these institutions. So all that to say, I adamantly believe that there should be very passionate dialogue in these forums. It should be as pure as possible. It should not be watered down. Representatives should be as diverse as possible. I mean, you can point to any work of James Madison and see this so purely when this document was being written, that the purpose of the House of Representatives was to have a diverse body of individuals representing people directly so that those opinions were as pure as possible. So by the time you get through the dialogue and you get within policy, it factors in all those different viewpoints. What I think the very quick failure was of the founder, one of these failures, is the creation of political parties that are so locked into these opposing factions that there really is no opinion besides these two that exists. And it's not something that necessarily is prescribed by the Constitution. So all that to say, yeah, absolutely. We should be challenging every single portion of this document. Every law in place should be questioned. I agree with that wholeheartedly. There are certain things that I think are sacred and we should approach with caution, but absolutely.
Yeah, that was amazing insight. You've already mentioned several things, but what do you think has led us to this point? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that the $10 million question? Like, what got us to this point? It's a multitude of things. Like, I think people have become heavily reliant, and I speak for myself, on these institutions performing a certain way. It's predictable, it's comfortable. We are a nation that is heavily, heavily addicted to convenience, and that expresses itself in, I believe, almost anything you can think of when it comes to shopping, when it comes to the way that we communicate, when it comes to our form of government. We really do a wonderful job of outsourcing anything we're really uncomfortable with and don't really care so much to see what happens in the background. Unfortunately, this desire pushes up against with a difficult reality that these issues are so complicated that they require an intimate knowledge and sort of a relationship with that dialogue in order to be able to engage purposefully. And an example that I'll give is a great deal of tension that I've been feeling from the Democratic Party, and I say that the capital D Democratic Party is throughout the course of my race, has been this sort of desire to water down messages such that they are digestible. I'm someone who really does enjoy getting into the weeds. I've written scholarly articles on constitutional law that got way beyond the weeds, such that I've been cited on these things. But I think that that is the value of an elected official. They are supposed to be that person that is able to communicate those concepts and not have to water them down to a point where people can't comprehend them, but they should be able to translate them in a way that's digestible. We've moved away from that such that the ads that we see, I can point to them specifically here in New Jersey. You see ads for the gubernatorial race that are incredibly positional and essentially saying the same thing. Both candidates are too expensive for either of us to afford. And the other one is incredibly problematic for these reasons, and so is the other. So you're left with this impression where I don't really know why, but I'm not supposed to like either of them, and it's going to be expensive no matter which one I choose. That falls short of what I think the civic duty is of any elected official. It is to educate, it is to inform, and to give more than enough detail for people to be able to make informed decisions of who they want representing them based on that analysis, not the position itself. That's prepackaged BS, in my opinion.
So, what can we do to better garner civic engagement?
I think we need to make it fun again. We need to make it exciting. And by doing so, like, I think people will naturally feel inclined to participate. I'm somebody that never thought of themselves as a political candidate. I never once wanted to touch this sphere. I thought it was too toxic. Come to find my inclinations were somewhat right, but I do so now as a form of necessity because I really do believe that individuals like myself, and I mean that not just as a transgender woman, but as an intersectional person, are so highly scrutinized and under attack in a very pointed way. If we don't step up, if we don't organize, like you mentioned in the introduction to this episode, I really do think we'll get to a point where the harm will be something that is irreparable. So it's really time to start taking interest. And right now, there's a lot of cleanup to do, unfortunately. There are so many groups that are so heavily involved, that are branded in ways that are very supportive, but realistically, from personal experience, what I've seen, a great number of them are hollow in what the intention actually is. And it all boils down to this, well, people aren't really going to understand any of this anyway. So how much of it really matters? I think we need to start moving away from that and do some of the dirty work, which is getting involved, having uncomfortable conversations, pushing candidates to give you more than prepackaged, simple answers to issues, and really dig into what it is to have a form of participatory democratic government in this country. We moved away from it in such a difficult way. A few policies that I think would be really useful. Every employer should be required to give you a day off for any election day, local all the way up to federal. Nobody should have to work and it shouldn't impact your pocket. But beyond that, I do think it should be compulsory to have people vote. We can tie it to receiving some sort of benefit or tax cut. I don't believe in penalties. I believe in motivating people through empowerment. But at the same token, I think it should be compulsory to have people vote. Because without that engagement, such a small portion of the population is making the decisions for everybody else when the vast majority of us don't really agree.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it just feels like, especially our politics now, it's so disembodied, it's so divisive, everybody's screaming at each other, and it's like how can we cool the flames, ground ourselves, and actually like receive what someone else is saying?
Well, that's the thing, right? And I sort of hinted at this before. I don't think the right move right now is to water down that anger and those emotions before having the dialogue. I think it's a necessary part of recognizing where we are and the positions that each of us take. I think we do ourselves a disservice by watering it down. And you see this in so many ways with what I see, like whole example I'll give, because I mean, this is queer story time. I'm going to focus on trans issues, right? So this argument about protecting children from transgender ideology and this like contagion theory on what trans identity is so bizarre because it waters down what the real fear is. And you see a lot of people on the left focus on this idea that this is born from ignorance. This is something you educate through. I personally don't believe that's the case. These people who are arguing understand that this is an indirect way to impose policy that has implications beyond just, oh, we're protecting children from predators. It's the same ideology that was used to villainize homosexuality in the 80s and the 90s and for ages, right? Like the playbook has been seen time and time again. It's never about what that is. And I think that is a product of watering down the argument. People are afraid to enter that room and say, look, I do not agree with the way that you live your life. I do not agree with your identity. I have hate towards your community. That is a much harder thing to figure out how to balance. But if you don't even have that conversation, then you do a disservice because you're never even engaging in a dialogue because we're over here arguing about something that doesn't exist, which is the fact that trans people are pedophiles and are going to be raping children in restrooms. The majority of these crimes are performed by a very particular type of cis man. So the data doesn't support it. The real life lived experience doesn't support it. But here we are focused on this micro issue that doesn't really change the larger picture. And I think in part it's because we're afraid to disagree with each other and we're afraid of those emotions.
Right. That's another thing that's perplexed me. Being almost finished with medical school right now, it's like we've reached such a place in society where people are arguing with experts, people that are scientists and physicians. It blows my mind. that people are prioritizing their own beliefs about something of which they have no expertise in.
Yeah, I think it's a huge, huge issue that people feel so skeptical about their sources of information that they've reverted to trusting their guts about things that are so highly complex that there is no way your gut inclination would ever make sense in that context. We're talking medicine, we're talking physics, we're talking human anatomy, things that require advanced degrees just to have a cohesive conversation about it, let alone to actually digest the information. So you got people who think of like doing research as like reading Facebook posts. And unfortunately, it's stems from this idea that I think we've forgotten how to disagree with each other. And we've forgotten that there is a place for these emotions. There is a place for this disagreement. But the goal should always be to find a form of consensus that addresses the merits of the issue beyond the facade of what we perceive to be the fear and danger. Because right now, we're only engaging on that surface level sort of fear, and we need to be able to dig deeper into that. But I don't think we can get there unless we really start coming to terms with the reality that what we have is a group of people that is not insignificant in our population, that has a deep sense of hatred and fear towards our community, that is based on religious values that are difficult to parse out without really engaging.
Yes, absolutely. And there's even scientific evidence to show, like, neurobiologically what is happening in this population. And it's not to pathologize these people, it's a literal, like, fundamental physiological, neurobiological perspective saying that when people are, for example, conservatives are in this deep fear state of transgender people, hearing these repeated narratives and these repeated fear tactics by the Republican National Convention and by MAGA extremists, hearing that day in and day out, and that's your ongoing news coverage every day of the year, your amygdala, which is your fear center of the brain, is constantly receiving that input. And when your amygdala is currently heightened and in a heightened state, it actually shuts down your prefrontal cortex, which sits right behind this frontal bone right here, which is your center for critical thinking and logic. And it's such a like simple science thing for me to like understand, and for many people to understand. It's like, if we want to move this narrative beyond where it's at currently, people have got to like calm down and, work with that and not intake all of this like fear mongering. Because when somebody's operating on that level, they're always in a fight or flight response, and you're not going to be able to speak to them if they're on that level.
Yeah. No, totally. I personally think that we need to start engaging in the real merits of these conversations such that there is room for some of that animosity. Because I don't think that individuals who feel these things will be able to process those emotions unless they feel them and sit with them and express them and feel them acknowledged. Because if you look at the kernel of what these fears are, unfortunately, it is something all of us can resonate with, albeit incredibly twisted and manipulated. Everybody will have sympathy for children who are victims of sexual assault. That is a legitimate fear that people have. How they got there, the reason for it, all of it makes absolutely no sense. But like you said, you're not able to engage in logic when these conversations are actually taking place. So what you need to do is get people to a point where they've expressed the fear and emotion, have sat with it enough where they move past it. And now we're back at the logic phase and having concrete discussions about the reality of what that fear is based on. And the more we avoid that tension, the greater the problem, because we just become far more polarized. So it's a roundabout way of saying that while a lot of people, particularly in my race, will have platforms that are incredibly centrist and very, very PC, the reality is what I think is needed is that polarization to play itself out, which requires a commitment to the values that people hold unapologetically and directly, so that we can have that dialogue on essentially our biggest stage as far as policy is concerned.
Yeah, and you're pointing to something too. Again, I'm thinking science and medicine here, but when we talk about trauma and like people living in this fear state and not being able to react to that trauma or being able to react to that fear, I think that's what you're alluding to, Vale, is them like not having the physical action to get that out. And that in trauma healing, when we're talking about this from a scientific perspective, that's incredibly important. Because when we talk about fight or flight, that action of moving your body away from the threat is incredibly important. And I think what we're seeing in our modern politics is that people are rigidly holding on to this stuff and they have no outlet to let it go. So they're just in this like ongoing cycle of chaos in their mind and body. And so I think it is important what you're saying, that we have spaces for people to like get that out. Otherwise, we're going to continue being in the same toxic mess and divisiveness that we're seeing on display right now.
You only get that type of insight either from lived experience or through professional experience. And as someone who has lived through trauma, has done the work to sort of heal as best as I can at this point, these are the informed ways that I can come towards policy because I understand that lived experience. I think we lack that because we sanitize politicians in this country to a point where they don't even recognize themselves, because that's the way to get elected, right? Don't say anything controversial. Don't be anything controversial. Don't have had any type of hiccup or record in your past because you're suddenly unelectable. I think the opposite is true. How do I trust that you know how to address any of these things if you've never lived it? Specifically with respect to trauma, how do I know you know how to navigate that at all? What resources could you possibly recommend that make sense based on any experience that you have beyond what you hear or perceive to be useful? Whereas someone with that direct lived experience can speak from personal experience and professional experience as to what might help.
And this brings up a question in my mind, which is dangerous. No. Do you think there should be particular qualifications for people aspiring towards elected office?
I'll say this much. I do think there are certain things that are incredibly useful, but they are not things that I think most people would take into account initially. I think that the bare bones of what it is required to be a representative of the House. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a certain age and U.S. citizen, I believe. They're very bare bones. It's very minimal. It's not very much. You have to reside in that state, I think, if you're elected. You don't even have to be where you're running, as many of my opponents know. They don't even live in the district. But what I do think is important, realistically, is a perspective on enough issues based on your reality that go beyond just blanket statements that are already present. And that to me is essential, because what you want ideally for the best dialogue is people with specific perspectives on various issues from very different lived experiences that can come to the table and tease out the minutia. Why we have committees is why we have subcommittees, to have forums, to have that dialogue. But unfortunately, what we currently have is a group of people that tends to look very, very similar to one another and has very, very similar experiences, even in their existence and how they differ. Sure, you've got the one from Texas and you've got the one from California and you've got the one from New York, and they just, one calls them subs and the other calls them hoagies. And realistically, it's not much of a difference, but if you have people from very diverse backgrounds present, you really can engage in a dialogue, because you can receive the perspective of somebody whose religion was completely different from yours or devoid of any sort of religious practice. So for me, the prerequisite is something that isn't present in that room immediately. There are tons of skills that you could pick up along the way with respect to policy drafting. Being a lawyer, I think, is incredibly helpful. After all, you're running to be a lawmaker. You should understand how the law works and how to draft policy and how all that comes into play. But there are resources available to people. Every single one of elected officials will have lawyers at their disposal to help them navigate this. I think the most important thing really is a lived experience. Luckily, I seem to possess all of those things I cited. So
I think so. I know so. So to shift gears a little bit, I want to go back to something that you mentioned in your introduction. And I just want to find out or have you express what creating the conditions for economic, racial, and social justice looks like in our country.
It expresses itself in what we see to be performative acts of assistance in many forms of government. You'll take economic because that's something that I work very closely with. In my current practice, I focus quite heavily on finding entrepreneurs that are open to alternative business structures and exploring how we might be able to develop more ethical practices. These aren't revolutionary concepts. I'm not the one initiating them. They've been around for ages and they're very successful around the globe. You have cooperatives that are billion-dollar companies. You have mutual aid organizations that feed dozens of individuals or provide different resources. It's not anything that is really unseen. It's just not the norm because we're taught that what it is to be business savvy means maximizing profits at all costs. And let's think again, who does that benefit? Same people in power. So when I think of economic justice as a practice, as an actual implementation of something concrete, it takes what's already in place and pushes its intent to its furthest extreme, such that everyday people feel empowered to take the same risks that wealthy elite individuals are allowed to do so and allotted as successful because they have that safety net. So they're able to really jump, but you don't see how their failures impact them because, well, they usually don't. They've got enough safety nets to not really care. So for me, an example I'll give, a policy that I'd recommend is I think we should focus on expanding the SBA to really focus on micro businesses as opposed to small businesses. You can have 500 employees, I think is the number, somewhere around 400 or 500 employees. And I think it's $5 million in revenue. In my opinion, you're at that point. It doesn't feel very small to me anymore. Like that is a sizable business. And sure, it's not a multi-million dollar conglomerate, but you are also not what most people think is a small business. It's just really wonderful branding that has emerged through that agency. So I think the failure of that agency is, for example, a lot of their loan programs require a substantial amount of money in reserves in order to qualify. You also need business plans. You also need various other skills on how to navigate the procedure. You need to have great credit. They're all things that most people who are typically living on the margins don't have. How do you now empower entire communities who don't have any of these qualifications to qualify for programs that were intended to stimulate economies? What ends up happening is large banks administer these loans or broker them and take fees off these things and are really just feeding themselves because the people that start these businesses are all qualified in the ways that they want. So it's just feeding itself. Whereas if you fund micro businesses directly, remove all these barriers, provide counseling, provide direct representation to help people navigate the complexities, grants that don't have any requirements beyond making sure that the money that is provided stays within the local economy, that is a much more powerful way to revitalize a certain area or a certain community, because now you've got someone who can hire people in their community, who can set up a bakery, who can set up a grocery store, who can set up a contact lens business. Whatever it is you need dozens of these. It never needs to be the most revolutionary thing. Not everyone has to invent an electric car. We need tons of services day in and day out. And I would much rather be funding people's pockets who are currently reliant on unemployment or other public services to then start their own businesses and have jobs.
Yes, that's amazing. And it has huge implications for our community, the queer and trans community, that
Oh, yeah.
because of our relationships and the cishet patriarchy prioritizing heterosexual relationships, we don't start out having access to that type of care, essentially.
Absolutely. It's something that I think is lacking in our community, and it's difficult to foster because we don't have those biological relationships to really rely on. Many of us don't have close-knit relationships with our biological families, and we end up forming them externally. But again, you've got this sort of gap in mentorship that exists. And a lot of these skills and a lot of this knowledge is passed down because you've got someone that knows this stuff. Myself, as an example, when I got into law school, I was incredibly fortunate to have been dating somebody whose father was a lawyer. And through that relationship, that's the first lawyer that I met personally that had a successful career. And so many bits of advice flowed from that dynamic, even after our relationship, not because of no obligation or anything. I just had that friend and resource to ask questions that I felt embarrassed asking somewhere else. So we need to start empowering people to sort of build these relationships, but you can't do that unless the person above you has that lived experience to then pass on. It's a tricky thing to navigate, but you do it by building community.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think in you expressing all of this, we can see how economic, racial, and social justice are all interconnected and interdependent upon one another, which is not something that I hear a lot of conversation on in these conversations out in the world. Sometimes you do hear about it when people are talking about intersectionality, but this is something, especially given that this is queer story time, that directly impacts our community. And it's something that we have not fully figured out yet. So it's really important to hear people like you actively speaking out about this, and not just towards the queer and trans community, but the disabled community and other communities that are marginalized within the United States right now and beyond. So another avenue that I want to bring in is you just sharing about your lived experiences as a Chicana, as a trans woman, and how those experiences are informing the various policy initiatives that you wish to pursue.
I like highlighting those aspects of my identity specifically for the reason you mentioned. I took a lot of courses on various different cultures and I'm being exposed to just human anthropology and figuring out like what it meant within society for certain groups to organize the ways they do and why those dynamics exist. So it's a sort of a pet project of mine to sort of explore just human interconnectedness. And it's not something that I've studied formally. I mention that because essentially each of these labels are often looked at as sort of stagnant individual things. And one of the professors that I had very early on made a really funny joke that sort of stuck with me. And she sort of like joked that this idea that cultures are these like blobs that just sort of exist in society and just sort of walk around as like individual little culture thingies is like kind of ridiculous. And like that little visual of like the culture with arms is like a blob was just really funny because it made it that ridiculous. This idea that like this is your label and you fit within that label. They're all so interconnected. But what they do is encapsulate certain experiences that tend to sort of spread from that identification. So for myself, I like using the term Chicana, one, because it's accurate. I am first generation Mexican American, but two, because it has a political origin story. The Chicano rights movement in, Southern California, all of the Southwest is something that is incredibly powerful and poignant at the moment, given what we're seeing with immigration. So I think it's important to lean into those tendencies and lean into those identities to make sure that people understand that my identity is interconnected with those groups of people and that shared struggle, such that I know what it is to be someone who has parents who were undocumented and not realize the risk that ran. I also know what it means to have naturalized parents who are now US citizens and worry about administrations deciding on a whim that they're going to pull that away. But when it comes to being trans, it's also such a wonderful microcosm in a different expression of what a lot of that oppression looks like in a different flavor. So a lot of the struggle that I see myself pushing up against as a Chicana, which is being perceived as uneducated, the lack of social mobility, the lack of access to economic resources or mentorship or different cultural dynamics that are difficult to navigate because of language barriers or whatever it may be, also expresses itself in such a unique way within the trans community because of those like same systemic issues. So while sure, they are distinct and in completely different communities, when you look at each of them and make sure that you take them into account, you start to notice a pattern in how most marginalized communities live. And the oppression is typically seen by focusing on aspects of the community that are deemed undesirable or unprofessional in a lot of spheres. And after that, sort of like villainizing that community for that reason and ostracizing them for that. So when I speak as a trans Chicana, when I speak as someone who has various different neurodivergent sort of labels attached to them, it's because of the fact that I see how interconnected all of those identities are in seeking liberation.
That's powerful.
Mhm.
Yes. So I know that being a trans woman running for a congressional seat can be quite complex. And I'm curious if you're comfortable speaking about some of the interactions that you've had, just even if it's campaigning or within the Democratic Party. Like, what has that experience looked like for you thus far?
I feel to an extent a bit disillusioned, but not because of new information. I think it was par for the course. It's what was expected. But I do feel more disillusioned by seeing it play out the way it has. And I do understand what it means for most people to look at a political party and not see yourself in it. And in me pushing sort of to incorporate the various communities that I come from to have a platform within the Democratic Party, a large reason for me choosing to run as a Democratic candidate is to start having people see themselves in the party again. Because what often happens is our issues are sort of thrown under the rug and left to sort of ride on the coattails of others. And it's seen as appropriate because it's a means to an end. But unfortunately, like I've been saying this entire sort of session, it's what I think does the biggest disservice to these communities. And it starts to really feel like lip service when you see capital D candidates and establishment candidates co-opt hashtags or words or phrases that are used to describe individuals who have nothing to do with the establishment, but nonetheless sort of run on these principles as if they're incorporated into their platform while accepting corporate PAC money. And it's the strangest dynamic to sort of navigate because you start to really get concrete examples of how disingenuous it all is. It's not something that I think people would be surprised to hear, but to live it is another thing. And I've been specifically directly told by elected officials, I won't name names because what's the need? It doesn't change anything. But the reality is that I've been told I'm too trans. And again, I've been told that these issues should ride on the coattails of others that are more palatable because that's the only way this stuff ever really gets done. So the capital D Democratic Party has made it incredibly clear that I would not be receiving any support from them maybe until after the primary, should I win. I didn't expect it anyway, but I understand why most Americans don't see themselves in either party. And it sort of feels like I'm going to show up, I'm going to do what I have to do. But the reality is, I don't care. I don't care so much about any of these people because they never look like me. They never sound like me. They all just sort of give me the same BS. The example I gave about both candidates for governor in New Jersey being too expensive never really resonates with anybody. In fact, most people don't even know who these people are. They just know that they have to vote blue or red. And that disservice comes from the ideology and the dogma that exists within the party system, because you'll have people reach out and offer support, but really all they've ever offered is for me to make four-figure donations at a minimum towards galas and parties, which I'm supposed to be a speaker at, by the way. So explain to me how I'm the entertainment, but I'm also required to give money to a party that has explicitly told me it's not giving me anything in return until maybe after June if I win. But then at the same in the same breath, you see posts from these people saying they're grassroots and they're about people, and it's the same nonsense every single cycle to a point where people have disengaged so heavily that you kind of just don't care. And I think it's time that we start caring again, but that's only going to happen if we start seeing people who are unapologetically themselves run and actually run on platforms that we resonate with.
Yeah. What sense do you make of the Democratic Party drifting towards the right? We see, whereas Gavin Newsom has some amazing like clapbacks against the current administration, you see Gavin Newsom engaging in transphobic rhetoric. You see Pete Buttigieg engaging in transphobic rhetoric. Help me make sense of it.
I think it's twofold, and it's such a good example to use because I think, again, we have been trained by consumerism to sort of outsource our issues into people and seek out these sort of heroes that will be a one size fits all like fix to every issue that we have. And the moment that they express a value that we don't resonate with, then suddenly we're completely disillusioned. But really, we set them up to fail in a lot of ways. So I think it's twofold in that way. But the other side of that is this current political system that lives outside of our form of legal government, the party system, is such that it creates a dynamic where what is being pushed is preservation of the entity and the dogma as a whole to control power, because that tension lives through very, very slim margins at the moment. So you can't have people who have open dialogues or defect from the majority, because what that does is you kill that very slim margin that you have to preserve the whole of what it is your administration is pushing. You saw it with Obama's administration, you saw it in Biden, you're seeing it with Trump, where government shutdowns and sort of freezes are always looming. And it's because there really isn't any dialogue. There's complete, absolute positions and just enough to hold them to make enough of a bad day for the other side to sort of like bend on a couple things. So all that to say, I think the trouble that we have with the current system is that it runs on this desire to sort of run towards the middle to avoid any problems, because we will always have such a fine line to balance that nobody can really step out of line anyway. So we're doing ourselves a disservice to continue to prop up these parties such that they continue to run in this way. It all comes from our lack of civic engagement, our lack of knowledge with respect to really what the dynamics of each candidate, each elected official, and what their votes actually mean day to day, what they're even doing. Most of us don't even know that a lot of congressional candidates spend a lot of time out of the country. And because it's not popular to discuss those issues, Representative Crockett spoke about this, and she spends a lot of time going to other countries to do observations and inquiries as to how things are being administered and run with respect to US aid or something along those lines. We don't really know what these people do. We just know that that one is branded as the one that's closest to me, and all I have to do is constantly support that one because it means my complete safety.
Yeah, that's a very deep answer. But I just find myself wondering, how can we operate within a political system that accepts people for who they are and not debate people's lives? And like, can we all come to the table with that level of awareness and know that like spewing hatred towards particular individual communities is not societally acceptable? Like, we can talk about policy, we can disagree about policy, but we're not going to disagree about people's fundamental existence. And it sounds like to me that's a message and a narrative that neither one of our dominant parties here in the US have seemed to embody or understand.
I think what we forget is the fact that these parties are not positional in any real way. They are products of branding. And branding and consumerism in our capitalist society is incredibly dependent on public opinion and what you can sway. And right now, we're very accustomed to these prepackaged molds that tend to work in certain ways because they appeal to the specific kind of people that show up religiously to vote. It's time that the rest of us really start picking up the mantle and really just running with what we think is appropriate, because we're missing in the dialogue entirely. And it's because we don't see ourselves, so we automatically count ourselves out. That's sort of what I'm hoping to inspire. I'm hoping that people in this district specifically, that is incredibly diverse. I mean, we've got farms and we've got like big cities, and I'm 30 minutes where I'm located from New York City, but the furthest boundary of this district borders like northern Pennsylvania. So there is every type of person in this district, but what that also means is there is every type of person also that does not see themselves in what the majority is feeding them. And I think it's time that we start seeing candidates like that and start expecting them. And we can only do that if we start showing up. And it's not fun and it's not glamorous, but it's necessary because we're going to start seeing consequences that begin to impact us one by one in ways that finally make us uncomfortable enough to stand up against this hatred. If you're not uncomfortable with what's happening in the detention centers, which are essentially concentration camps, I really don't know what else to express to sort of galvanize your support beyond it isn't long before you get attacked in a way that hits just as poignantly for you and pushes you into action. But by that point, it's already too late in many ways because the other group of people that has been religiously showing up already has momentum.
Right. And do you think a lot of these dynamics that we're talking about, I mean, not only the rise of fascism within the United States, but all of these dynamics of which we're talking about politically, do you think that is what is making room for this new wave of, democratic socialism we see in New York? Zohran Mamdani has made a lot of amazing progress up there. Do you see democratic socialism as more of the new wave of the future politically in the US?
I see it as an absolute counterbalance. I really do. I think it's something that a lot of people crave. I think it speaks towards an issue that I sort of think merits discussion right now is the fact that in the United States, we have labels that we believe mean something. And again, it's a product of branding by the political parties of what certain things mean. And we know that, like, oh, socialism means the USSR, Cuba, North Korea, and those are oppressive nations that it doesn't work. It doesn't work for the people. It doesn't work economically. So we're good. We have the strongest GDP. So we must be the most successful company and everybody here must be living great, right? Realistically, most Americans don't know what socialism is. They don't understand the fact that we live in a society that is a democratic socialist nation. We have various services that are provided for public benefit that people rely on: Medicaid, Medicare, public assistance as far as food is concerned, but even your public highways and railways and trains. Like, there is not an aspect of government services that we do not interact with day to day. And embracing the fact that these services are a natural part of government sort of starts pushing up against that tension that we are just a purely capitalist society. Another example I'll give to sort of really draw the point is we glorify our system of economics as pure capitalism. Realistically, if it was pure capitalism, nothing would ever be too big to fail. If a bank was engaging in certain conduct that leveraged itself too highly, like in the 2008 housing crisis, and it had to go out of business and we lost the major banks and it had a catastrophic effect on our economy, that is what capitalism does because that is the market at work and correcting itself. We constantly prop up these institutions and consider it to be capitalism, but realistically, it's far more akin to authoritarian socialism. And again, another thing that really important is sort of frame the conversation we're having. And I'm sure you're aware of this, but a lot of our listeners might not be. Socialism has a lot more to do with an economic form of governance. That is the counterbalance or the counterexample to capitalism as another form of economic governance. Authoritarianism, which I think a lot of people conflate with socialist societies, is a completely different thing with respect to political control and a dynamic within the ruling government. So the counter to that, I would think, is more akin to democracy. So I think democratic socialism as something that is being popularized by candidates who are doing amazing work in really spreading the word as to what that platform really means, like Zoran Mamdani, is something that is important, not because I think it is the one size fits all solution to anything, but it's the counterbalance that we're seeing. And again, I think our system of government is so dependent on that level of engagement that I think it's important that we start allowing candidates that run on these platforms to have a say in what happens at government, because whereas the far right fascist, who also has a place in government to express those values, I don't believe in any of what they're saying. I don't agree with it, but I do think they should be able to express it. Needs a counterbalance. And that is that answer that we're getting in New York.
Absolutely. So, shifting gears yet again, I want you to take this opportunity to share about what policy initiatives you find particular salient for District 7 in New Jersey.
I think there's a huge focus right now on healthcare, and I think it's appropriate for us to be focusing on it because it's an issue that we've tried to fix for decades and continuously come back to the table to sort of struggle and figure out what direction we should take. And we're sort of at this point where it's not really working. It's come to a real head. But For communities like ours specifically, we see a sort of microcosm of the worst of it play out, where the insurance companies are able to set policy on what actually happens as far as your healthcare is concerned. And that happens for anybody. It happens for diabetics. It happens for people with sickle cell anemia. It happens for any medical condition. But for trans people, you can sort of see it popularized as something that might feel more appropriate to sort of create barriers to access because it's such an unpopular sort of issue that it starts to feel less problematic that people like us don't have access to healthcare. But the idea that a corporation, and oftentimes in conjunction with your employer, since most large corporations who employ people are self insured, is able to dictate the level of care that you receive, irrespective of what your doctor might say, is ridiculous, in my opinion. The way that it works in practice is so convoluted that most people do not know how to engage with it. And trans people have made it sort of common practice and gotten incredibly good at navigating the healthcare system because every appointment, every request for care often involves self advocacy beyond what most people have to engage with. So, what I believe is in focusing on healthcare and making it accessible for marginalized communities, again, you get to see those ripple effects play out for other people in a way that is more accessible. In essence, by highlighting the difficulties that the trans community faces, what you see is the same struggles that other people face, but all crunched up in one because for this community, it's palatable to push on them so much adversity just to receive basic care. So, the appeals process, the numerous like levels of documentation, letters, proof essentially, like you have to prove not only to your doctor that you are transgender, but that you warrant healthcare. So this idea that everyone's just handing out like gender confirmation surgeries is ridiculous because the number of hurdles you have to jump through is nuts. But you see it as well in any other community. So I think access to healthcare is incredibly important. I think economic justice is incredibly important. I think billionaires are a travesty. Nobody should amass that much wealth. I don't think it's a badge of honor or success that they exist. I think it's disgusting. It's wealth hoarding. This idea that that money would ever circulate, it's ridiculous. Like it doesn't happen. At this point, we've got 20 years of post trickle down nonsense. It doesn't work.
No, it does not. Get rid of the billionaire class.
Completely. People should have to pay tax. There are these loopholes that billionaires exploit to not technically have income where they leverage the stock that they own to borrow money to then live off those loans. And because it's a loan, it isn't taxed. I'd make that completely illegal if I were elected. I'd propose a bill that makes it illegal for you to be leveraging those things for purposes other than to fund the business itself. You see the same happen with leverage buyouts. They were illegal before. We've made them legal now, and it facilitates the creation of a class that hoards wealth beyond what is economically viable for a nation like ours. We may have a really high mean income, but that's because it's so skewed in this country. If you look at the median income in this country compared to other nations that are similarly situated, I think we're like 11th or 12th.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the areas where socialism as a system works to give workers more empowerment in that they actually contribute to the ownership of the company that they work for versus this like hierarchical like CEO that's making 45 times or 200 times what like the lowest income worker makes. So I think that's a part of the societal conversation that we need to have, which is kind of in that area of like class consciousness is, you know, how can we create these systems where workers have more empowerment within the businesses that they work for?
I think unfortunately, there's huge barriers to entry into any of these professions. Not only do you have to be good at whatever you choose to do, there's this stigma that any business you start has to be the most revolutionary thing in the world, or you have to be the absolute best to compete. Because again, we're in this environment where like everything is competition and everything is profit driven. There are tons of alternatives that are successful and exist in everyday life that we can look to for different paths to how we govern the way that we access different resources or make our livelihoods. An example I'll give is cooperatives and different forms of businesses. There are B corporations, there are legal structures that provide some sort of insulation that allow you to make decisions that help the collective and society, that don't focus exclusively on profits. Rather than being seen as a viable alternative, quite often they're looked at just problematic because you're not going to get public investment, or you're not going to get different resources that might be available if you were purely profit driven, because again, investors would be looking at it favorably. But what we should be looking at is ideas that businesses don't necessarily have to grow into the biggest thing ever. It is perfectly okay to have a family business that has been run for 10, 20 years, whatever it may be, that just sort of exists to sustain that family. And that is perfectly fine. And we've had that before, where we have artisans or individuals that sort of filled specific needs in society. But what has happened is we've given way to large corporations, in part because we're so price sensitive. I don't think it is unfair to be looking for lower prices and to be price sensitive in today's economy, but we need to acknowledge that it is a byproduct of us feeding these corporations our dollars, that we don't get them back in our communities and then don't have them in our pockets to circulate. So sure, my glasses would be slightly more expensive if I went to a local optometrist as opposed to a large corporation and purchase glasses from a large factory. But on the whole, that money would go to that specific optometrist in my community, who then would spend that money on groceries, who then would spend that money at this local business. It's circulating within that same environment. Extractive businesses on the size of like Walmarts and Targets and such, what they do is funnel that money externally, and that's how you drain it from communities. So focusing on price, albeit important, I think is backwards.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And yeah, these are the conversations that we need to be having. And I know you're going to be discussing these nuances on your campaign. So, in conclusion of this episode, I just want to mention something, a little hot take that you have. And you mentioned that, quote, performative allyship is more dangerous than hate. Marginalized communities don't need hashtags, likes, or, quote, thoughts and prayers, unquote. We need action, even when it costs privileged folks money, status, or safety. The reality, we're already deep into the slide of fascism. Feel-good branding and kumbaya campaigns won't save us. Only solidarity and teeth will.
Wow, I love it. I'm already being quoted.
Yes, honey.
Be the narcissist in me.
No, girl, you're not a narcissist.
I'm just kidding. Frankly, I don't even see that as so controversial. I think it's so fundamental to what my platform is that I stand behind it wholeheartedly. I am so sick of performative allyship, to a point where I can't stomach it any longer. And it's what I've been seeing in establishment candidates, where people will use us as mouthpieces, but when it comes down to policy, they're either entirely silent on these issues or not willing to go far enough to actually be helpful. A very, very poignant example that I'll give without going into too much detail, because I don't want to like belabor the point, is when I finally reached what I felt was the pinnacle of my career as senior in-house counsel for a large retailer. This is like a household brand. People can look it up. I really thought that I had finally reached a point where I had a mentor. I had people in my circle that were advocating for me and my well-being, such that I trusted them with the intimate details of what the struggle was that I was facing. Bear in mind that as part of the legal team, I was talking to the person in confidence who would also be in the room making decisions about policies that impacted my ability to exist at this company. So when I say I struggled directly with access to healthcare, with restrooms, with dress codes, with changing my name, I was having these dialogues with people that I thought were in my corner, but all the while touting, yeah, we support your community. We're so happy to do this. Thank you for highlighting these issues. We worked for the better part of a year and a half on this stuff, pretty much my entire tenure at this place. And all it resulted in was performative, just Yeah, we changed your name. It took us 6 months. Isn't that great? Oh, well, restroom access. Why don't you use the executive restroom instead of the women's room? Because it's going to make other people uncomfortable. Never mind the fact that you were assaulted by somebody on staff because of your presence in the women's restroom. We're not going to talk about that. And we're just going to have you use a completely separate restroom because that's safer for everybody. Oh, the reason it's taking long for us to put out a policy on that issue is because we're looking to remodel the whole building. It was always this sort of like, sure, we're going to help, but it's going to take time and we're doing something, but it's complicated. So you have to be patient. What ended up happening? Company filed for bankruptcy and all the work that we did went down the drain. By the time they released the byproduct of everything that we had done, by the time my appeal had been decided, the company was completely done with. And I didn't know any of this was playing out in the background. I had glimpses of some sort of hardship, but I didn't know that it was that present. So all the work we did was nothing but performative because every victory that was given was empty because there was no dollar impact. I had the chief human resource officer explicitly tell me that a concern of hers for changing access to healthcare for transgender individuals was the cost. That was the primary reason why she had to counterbalance how much to give on this point. We were sitting there crying in each other's arms when we figured out a path for me to get a certain procedure that I was wanting to pursue. I'm not kidding when I say like this woman went from completely ignorant on trans issues to like my biggest cheerleader personally, but was working in the background to sort of block me from accessing care. And it all came down to dollars. And I don't blame them personally for these things. It is their job, their literal job, as prescribed by law, to focus on the financial impact that this would have. But that dynamic, it only creates policy and impact in people's lives that is performative in nature. So you get people that want to do the right thing, but are forced to do other. And it hurts you more than helps you because you think you're doing something when realistically, what I should have done is asserted myself as harshly as I could, as quickly as I could when I was denied initially, because at least then I would have had what I needed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a deep reflection on our current state of affairs and, how we can create systems and corporations, institutions, whatever you want to call it, that do deeply engage with the needs of the people within that community. So I don't claim to have answers. You certainly have more answers than I do. But I think it's a reflection for all people in positions of leadership when interfacing with somebody of a marginalized identity.
Yeah. And what I would sort of push back on with something you just said is you sort of preface what you were saying by saying that you don't have answers. What you have is your lived experience. What you have is the reality of what the issue is. That dialogue is what creates whatever our theory as to what might solve it would be. I think without that, we do ourselves a disservice. So rather than look for answers, I think it's more useful to look for the right questions. And that only comes from the community. That comes from the people that live the consequences of the policies that are imposed on them. So I don't claim to be someone that like understands everything and has every answer. I think it's unfair to look at any candidate in that way. And frankly, anybody that sells you any of that, I think you should be highly skeptical of. What I do think, however, is candidates should be wonderful conduits for dialogue and guiding conversations and giving voices to individuals who have something very powerful to say, but might not necessarily know how to say it or implement it. And I think that's the best service that a politician can give, is to really be a voice for their constituents and look at themselves as representatives of the whole, as opposed to prescribing what the party dictates should be policy to their communities.
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of kind of in a way like representatives are acting as therapists.
Yeah, yeah, in so many ways, like, everybody is an armchair therapist at this point, but it's important because it's part of our lived experience, so, like, who better to voice your frustrations towards than your represented official that actually has a say in making policy and how it impacts you. And that goes up and down the ticket, right? Like school board, you mentioned anyone in elected office should be who you go to with your concerns. But the reason I think a lot of us don't is it usually doesn't go anywhere, particularly in NJ7. Good luck getting a call back from our current congressional rep. There's an entire like grassroots organization called Finding Kane, and it's entirely on the fact that this man does not engage with the community. He makes no public statements. He just votes the way the party dictates. And aside from that, you're not going to see him until it's time to campaign again. I think that that sort of politician is tired, and we need to move away from that and really move towards individuals who are parts of the community. And you should know them intimately in the sense that I understand who this person is, and I know that there will be room for the dialogue, irrespective of what my position might be. And I get it. It's a lot more work. It's not as glamorous as being someone on a pedestal, but that's the job. That is the job, to represent people. It is in the job title. It is inherent to those duties. And if you're just someone who sort of does what the party tells you and don't really have anything to contribute beyond that, time to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's one of the major areas that is so wrong with modern politics is people get exhausted by being a representative. You know, if you're burning out and not wanting to engage with your community, then ultimately it's your time to leave and pass on the torch to somebody else.
Yeah, term limits immediately. Immediately. Like, I'm sorry, but you don't need to be a lifer. That is not the type of job that somebody should be there for life. A specific number of terms, that's up for dialogue. I don't know, but we have a gerontocracy in this country because of that dynamic specifically. What it has done, it has created government that is stagnant and doesn't reflect the majority. In part, I blame our generation for not picking up the slack and actually like engaging because, again, convenience culture. But realistically, it's time we start seeing fresh blood in that room. And we have a lot of people that bring a lot of value. And I'm not saying there isn't space for older individuals to hold elective office, but we need some mix of diverse opinions there for there to be some sort of dialogue beyond that, because all we get is people who think the exact same thing and have thought that way for the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and now is not the time.
No, I think we're done with that. Like, respect to our elders, nothing but, especially for anyone who has like accomplished any feat, the first impression. But at the same token, it's time you make room. And if you don't make room, then I'm going to start pushing because I think it's time that we get people who have fresh perspectives.
And that's something that we were just talking about privately. Yes, absolutely. Our elders can be an amazing source of wisdom, and that most certainly can hold the younger generation through trying times, but that is very well heard. People need to make wave for those of us that have more energy and vitality and want to actually commit to this work of societal change.
It's time to pass the torch.
Time to pass the torch. So for this last segment of QST, I call it Super Soul Questions. And we have very riveting conversations on this podcast. It's meant to kind of bring the energy down and be a space of self-reflection, maybe a little bit more spiritually oriented. So my first question to you is, at this moment in time, given all of your life experiences, what do you currently feel that your purpose is?
I think my purpose is to be as unapologetically myself as I can be because of how long it took me to embrace that. What I've seen is that the more I lean into my authenticity, the more it resonates with others, not because they share those qualities specifically, but because they're able to resonate with the authenticity itself. And that sort of evokes a desire for people to do the same. It takes a lot of courage to be 6 feet tall, put on some like rhinestone hot pink heels and a romper and go to your ex-boyfriend's wedding like that. It just evokes a certain reaction. And oftentimes, most people react positively after an initial shock because it's something that is just so bold that you can't help but sort of respect the courage, even if you don't agree with what it might look like or what it might be. So for me, it really comes towards leaning into what feels authentic, not watering it down because of external pressures. Especially as someone who is running for elected office, I'm really looking to give a voice to individuals who I think don't see themselves present, in part because they think they need to be manicured and really polished in order to get to this point. I am somebody who is no stranger to adversity and no stranger to having fallen down and made several mistakes. What I am is somebody who's done exceptionally well in picking up the pieces and building something new. And I think that that's exactly where this country is at the moment. We're at a point where there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of difficulty, and we need someone who knows how to clean it up. Who better than someone who has lived through some of it?
That is something that queer and trans people are experts at.
Like the way that we shine despite all the hardship we live through is so beautiful and celebrated. I mean, you think of how prevalent, specifically Black and brown trans women of color essentially prescribe and dictate what is queer culture in so many wonderful ways. And we need to start giving credit to those individuals by giving them platforms, and that includes every form of speaking that might not feel as polished, and every sort of accent that doesn't feel appropriate, and attire and ways of being. There's ways of being polished that is also authentic and unapologetically yourself. So I think it's time that we really start leaning into that. So my goal is to make others feel comfortable to do it by being comfortable myself.
Amen. Knowing what you know now, what would you tell your younger self about your identity?
Quite often, I think the answer that this evokes tends to focus on advice that would have helped them along the way. I don't think my journey was anything other than what it was supposed to be. I think I did exactly what I needed to do to keep myself safe, and I did it very well. Unfortunately, there is a price that I had to pay because of the fact that I was suppressing so much, and it took the form of various other issues that made my life really difficult. But I'm really happy with where I've arrived. So really the only thing that I would say is it's hard. It's going to be hard for a really, really long time. And like the freedom that you think you're going to get at a certain point is really just another form of sort of binding in your character because you don't have the skills to be yourself and feel confident about it. But there will come a point where you do, and you'll go through a heck of a lot, but you'll learn to heal through it. So I think that that hardship, I don't think anyone else should have to feel it. I think there are so many ways that we avoid it, but the reason I know how to avoid it is specifically because I lived through it. So my job is to prevent others from having gone through it, as opposed to looking at myself and wishing that I didn't live it. I lived it so someone else doesn't have to. My job is to make sure that happens.
Absolutely. What is one thing that you wish others understood about the gender and sexually expansive community?
That it doesn't have anything to do with our genitals. That is an aspect of our physical existence that is a component of what the experience is. But because we center the identity around sexuality or gender and anatomy comes into play, I think we get looked at very frequently as almost exclusively sexual beings. And it's something that specifically as a trans woman, I'll speak from my experience, rears its head in so many difficult ways because it's constantly re-educating people that this, the lips, the blush, all of it, the hair, it has nothing to do with my genitals. It's about my identity and showing up the way that I feel most comfortable. So that sort of tension leads people to sort of lean in with this weird curiosity that is somewhat morbid in its sexuality. It frequently comes from individuals who feel like it is inappropriate for them to be curious. So you get the questions about what your anatomy is, what procedures you might be having, and that is always where the conversation is centered. Whereas for me, my womanhood, my identity has so much more to do with everything else that it's almost a non sequitur to be discussing my anatomy, because the most difficult things for me to navigate are like how I show up in my attire, how I show up with like the makeup that I put on, how I sit down, all those types of things that make me feel more authentic, that I sort of been corrected throughout my entire existence. As a little kid, I remember my dad correcting the way I would breathe or laugh. Like, it was that pervasive. It does a very unique thing to you. Like, there was never a problem with my anatomy. They thought I had the right kind. So, like, it really was about, like, all my mannerisms and everything that I wanted to do and my interests. That, to me, has so much more to do with what our identities are. And I think the same is true of people who are sexually diverse in whatever way they might be, or are gender expansive in whatever form. It's so much more about what your existence is. The crux being my genitals is strange to me.
Right. Yeah, I personally resonate with that, like, policing of your mannerisms, because I too experienced that from my father.
They think they're helping, and it's weird and it's difficult, but they do think they're helping you.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to share on this topic is that genitalia does not have a gender identity. I find myself saying that all too often.
Gender is such a complicated issue, and it's such a complicated thing to engage with and learn, that again, we get these watered down branded portions of what gender means that exclude so many details that I think are so important to sort of engage with. But that's why people like us are so wonderful, because we are forced to engage with it, and it's knowledge that we now can share with others.
Absolutely. Next question is, do you have a particular message that you'd like to share with your prospective peers in the U.S. Congress that are creating laws against queer and trans people?
I take it from the way that's phrased, you're speaking about Republicans.
Whoever is creating laws against us.
I'd say there really is a lot of policing of various different groups in this country by individuals who cannot speak from experience, whether lived or through family, whatever it may be. But that stigma is difficult to combat when there aren't people in the room who can actually resonate with the counterbalance of what the arguments being made in that silo are. So I would encourage members of the current Congress to really start engaging with members of the community sincerely, not from a place of authority, but from a place of education, from a place of receiving information from a population that really has no connection to most of these individuals. I think the last figure I saw was somewhere around 1% of the population.
Slightly less than 1%. It's like 0.9.
Yeah, most people have never met a trans person. And if they have interacted with one, it's very loose and from fear. It's time we get to know each other. I'd be more than happy to engage in a dialogue with any elected official or any person that is based in actual curiosity, with space for hostility, with space for animosity, but understanding that what we're doing is having that dialogue, not having a shouting match, not being disrespectful. We are engaging in the dialogue of what is happening in society today and how we address it. Because I think what we get is a lot of elected officials that look as their job as prescribing solutions to what existence currently is in ways that they find problematic. I don't see our role as sort of policing what life is. I see our role as facilitating it, as encouraging what is healthy, as promoting diversity and different values to sort of flourish in ways that strip away those issues that we have a lot of problems with. Because by hypersexualizing people like us, by limiting our access to jobs, education, various resources, you create archetypes of individuals that exist because of that disadvantage and the disenfranchisement of these communities, that then are things that you're trying to correct or police, where what you really should be doing is just embracing these people with curiosity, which is what science is. You should seek to explain, not prescribe. But that would be my message. Engage with members of the community from a place of neutrality and just curiosity without looking to make solutions. It's their job to listen, not prescribe all the time.
100%. So well stated. What is your number one tip for queer and trans youth?
Find your voice as quickly as possible and assert it. It is a very difficult thing to learn to do tactfully and to learn to do assertively, but not disrespectfully. And I think it's a very important skill to have because 9 out of 10 times in professional circles or whatever it is, maybe interpersonal relationships, family dynamics, you will need the skill of disagreeing with somebody and asserting yourself and drawing a boundary. You might as well get really good at it as quickly as possible because that is something that you just will need to do in order to feel at peace with yourself, because most people have no understanding of what your existence is and will say something that is offensive that won't change unless you start pushing back on it and you start getting others to understand why it's problematic. You can't just shy away from difficult conversations like that. You have to learn to navigate them. And unfortunately, it is our burden to educate these individuals if we want to have a society where we all sort of engage with one another. Because at the end of the day, we are looking to create a group of people that sort of live together in a relative form of peace. There are compromises on each end. I think the compromise we need to start being more comfortable in making is that we are educators and we are in positions where we have to bring people along. You don't do that violently. You do that by creating community. So I used to joke about it because I hated it initially. And I was like, I'm not the trans ambassador. Stop asking me questions about this. And now, like, I understand that I kind of am. I have to be because most people will not have an understanding of what my existence is. So I need to get comfortable with explaining it in a way that feels authentic, but also draws firm boundaries.
That's such a powerful message, and I think you're the first guest to express the importance of that. But I know from my own lived experience, I wish that I would have found my voice so much earlier, because for anybody listening to this podcast that perceived me to be this powerful voice for change, that did not happen overnight. I used to be, this timid, quote unquote, boy that did not want to speak, that did not want to express. And now that's totally changed. But my point is that it's possible. And the earlier that you can find that, the more that you're going to be able to advocate for yourself, especially during these times that we're all facing in the US. So this is a bit more of a spiritual-ish question, but beyond all the chaos and everything we've talked about today, what brings you the greatest sense of connection in this world?
So I was raised Catholic, and of course, it never really felt authentic. It never really felt like it fit, that there's a great deal of shame and guilt that you have to work through and process as someone who is queer based on those teachings. But instead of really just rejecting it wholeheartedly, what I found myself doing was gaining a great deal of curiosity with various different ideologies. So I had a really wonderful teacher in middle school that thought it was incredibly important to teach us about every other form of religion that she could possibly find. And I thought that was incredible because there were so many parallels. So I had this like mini course in theology in middle school that I'm so grateful for because it made me really open-minded about spirituality and what that looked like. So I currently consider myself omnispiritual. I don't know what the right answer is. I think it's so deeply personal that everybody is correct and your faith is what gives it life. So to me, it's seeing others lean into their faith in a way that feels pure and authentic, because there's a very strange, unique sense of like bliss and peace that comes from people really giving themselves to their faith that I don't think you get in other spheres where you're constantly just wrestling with what's being prescribed rather than see it as something that needs to fit for me. Looking at it as something that fits for them and leaning into it in that way brings me a lot of joy. That makes me feel really interconnected with others because it makes me see that there are different ways to approach things that work for others quite well. And it's not my position to change that. It's my position to put a limit as to how it applies to my life to the extent there's something negative about it. But if I get to participate in the fun part of it, the like joyous, beautiful aspect of it, like going to baptisms or going to mosques or something, there's different ways of sort of like understanding what these lived experiences are. That makes me feel interconnected because then I can get a glimpse into what their inner workings are like.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful combination of everything that needs to happen in this country.
Just be curious and nosy in like a really lovely way, and like you'll get to know people, and 9 out of 10 times you're gonna like them. because people tend to be lovely.
Yes, absolutely. So where is Ms. Vale Mendoza going from here?
Well, continuing to campaign, I'm doing so in a very mindful way given how tense the climate is. But I will say this much to anybody listening who happens to be in my district or just someone who is supportive of my efforts. I wouldn't look for a traditional campaign. I won't be following the timeline that other candidates do. That doesn't mean I'm any less passionate. That just means that the avenues that I'm choosing to communicate with my constituents and with the general public are those that I'm best suited for and that will keep me safe, but also give me the broadest sort of impact on how it is I can share the messages that I think make me qualified for the particular seat that I'm running for. So that does mean that things will look very different, but I mean, hey, I'm a very different candidate. So something that I'll share here that I haven't shared anywhere else. And it's wonderful that I do so because it'll give me a very firm deadline to finish this project. That I'm going to be publishing a book in a series of chapters that will be released throughout the course of this campaign that will share very, very intimate details of my life so that every individual that wants to get to know more about me can do so in a setting where I'm able to speak to them directly. So the title of the book is The Curriculum of Hardship. It sort of chronicles my life. It's a biography, but not written in a linear fashion. And it sort of encapsulates various pivotal moments in my life that have sort of influenced my decision to run and my experiences as someone with such an intersectional identity. It's full of all the salacious details of a life that has been less than polished. It's full of all the joy that comes with it as well. But I think it'll give people a sense of who I am. And in partnership with that, what I'm doing is also publishing a companion to each chapter that also has policy positions that are informed by that lived experience. So I would invite everybody to look for it. It will be coming later this month. The first chapter will be just an introduction as to what the structure will be and what that looks like, but it'll give you enough details to get to know who this is, because what I think a lot of candidates sort of put after what it is they run on is sort of getting to know who they are in a more like intimate way. Because I think if I'm going to ask for that level of trust from people, I think they're entitled to understand who I am as a person and how that informs the policy positions that I take. So all that to say that it should be coming later this month, and I'm really hoping to finish it, but like writing a book is really difficult and I've never done it. So
That's such a phenomenal idea and such an innovative idea. I think it's really cool to see. I mean, you're the first congressional candidate that I've ever heard of doing that, like getting a book out before you're even elected. So I think that's a really awesome idea.
thank you. Thank you. I'm excited and it's really scary because it is sort of a tell-all. I think it's important that people get to know me as if we're having a conversation, which is the way I'm writing it. I am not looking to be the next Hemingway. Uh, I write contracts for a living, so I'm doing my best to write it in a way that feels like my authentic voice. So, yeah.
Amazing. I look forward to seeing it. And where can people find you if they would like to get in touch with you after listening to this podcast?
I have a pretty strong following on TikTok. That's typically what I use to communicate with people, but I'm on other platforms. You think the Meta platforms. My website is still in development. We've got several months before the primary. I'm not playing the capitalist politics that require a huge amount of cash infusion to just be memorable. You'll remember the 6-foot trans woman. So
And your username is Vote Vale across all social media, correct?
that's right.
Alrighty, Valentina. Well, thank you so much for being on Queer Storytime. It's been so lovely to have you and have this diverse conversation that we had today. It's been very meaningful, and I'm sincerely wishing you all the best on your congressional candidacy.
Thank you, Stevie. It's such an honor. This was an incredible experience. So I'm so grateful to just have the forum and to have you as a friend.
Yes, absolutely. Me as well. And thank you all for tuning in to episode 30 of Queer Storytime. Please don't forget to look out for an upcoming episode of QST being released in a couple weeks. I'll see you all next time. Hey friends, I'm so delighted that you've made it this far. My hope is that this episode has opened your heart and provided you with valuable insights into the lived experiences of those in gender and sexually expansive communities. There are several ways in which you can continue to engage with the Queer Storytime community beyond this podcast. You can join our free monthly queer and trans community connections group live online via Zoom. You can also join the QST community Patreon as either a free or paid member. Lastly, if you do have the financial means, you can donate to the Queer Trans Thriving Mutual Aid Collective that seeks to provide holistic, queer and trans affirming health services to those most in need within our community. Links to our community can be found in the description of this episode. From the bottom of my queer heart to yours, I'm sincerely grateful for you tuning in to Queer Storytime, the podcast. Hugs and love, y'all. Until next time.